Welcome back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And this week's guest, some of you longtime viewers or listeners might recognize, is Chuck Mollor. Chuck was nice enough to join us live at the Boston Startup event earlier this year, and he's back to talk a little bit more to us about some more business topics that I think you're going to love. Now, for those of you who are new to the show, first of all, welcome. Second of all, Chuck Mollor is a longtime member of the Boston business scene, from startups to larger businesses. He founded and still operates the incredible company MCG Partners. He also is a fellow author. So, Chuck, if you can do a better job than me, which admittedly is a low bar, could you provide some more info and introduce yourself?
No. Thanks, Jerry. I'm excited to be here. I thought that was well done. I'm not really sure what to add to that. I'm fortunate where I've built and run businesses in the past, and then I started my own firm, 17 and a half years ago, and got a great team, and really excited about what we do. Still am. But excited to be here. Thank you.
That's awesome. You mentioned you'd started businesses before, and you mentioned the impressive tenure of MCG Partners. You clearly made it out of the 5-year death cycle times 3+. And you did the smart thing in mentioning team. I've got to believe you've built the type of culture in that company that a team would thrive in.
No, thank you. I think that's really critical. It's probably one of the, if I was going to say, not to jump ahead here, if there's anyone that's out here listening to this that's either starting or thinking about or has a business, your people really is such a critical component of that. And it's not just about hiring the right people. It's about what's the work environment. In other words, what's the culture you're trying to create? Like, what do you value? What's the tone you set for why people, want to work with you, in addition to your services, your products, your business model, your strategy, your go-to-market, all those kind of things. I'm fortunate. I most of my people have been with me over 10 years, and I think it's because I created a work environment, a culture, in addition to their passion for what we do, that's allowed them to really thrive individually and collectively. So I think that's really, really critical.
There's a lot to unpack there, but there's two parts that I really want to hit. The first is, I don't know if it would be possible for me to agree more with your statement about people. It's one of the biggest parts of my book. The team that you build is your destiny, especially in all businesses, really, but especially in services businesses. Now, Chuck and I both work in the services industry, and if you don't have that's the closest to a special sauce one can have in services is their folks. And number two, 10+ year team members, Chuck, that's all culture. There's no universe where people stay in a business that long, in a job that long, in a role that long, without being in love with the culture there, and obviously the things attached to that, how they're paid, how they're, how everything's structured. But that's a testimony in and of itself to culture.
No, I agree. There is a lot of pieces to this, and I think your first question really is, what are the if I was going to really boil it down to the essence, it's what are the characteristics, the intangibles that allow a person to be successful in a work environment. So to be very specific, like most small entrepreneurial organizations and businesses, if a person really needs to be handheld often, needs a lot of guidance, a lot of mentorship often, an entrepreneurial environment's probably not the right environment for them. So I have, for the most part, a pretty experienced, seasoned team. And I have many different roles, many different, skills and expertise, in my organization. But I'm also looking for people that can thrive, in an environment where they can be highly independent, and also a focus on deliverables and key activities, not where they are and how many hours they work, right? So that's why I say when you talk about culture, there's so many pieces to that, but it really starts with those intangibles of what are those kind of characteristics you're looking for that often have nothing to do about a person's expertise or background or experiences. It's like, what are those intangibles going to allow them to thrive? And, and also, frankly, how do you create an environment where communication, agreeing to disagree, openness, input, where people feel empowered, people feel they have a voice, people feel they can challenge the status quo. All those, that all has to become part of it, especially in what I call entrepreneurial environments. For some of us like me, we continue to grow every year, but my team size for the most part has stayed the same. Yes, my additional consultants and trainers and coaches, that will expand or detract depending on what's going on in the business and the economy. But my core team has pretty much been the same size for most of these years. Maybe not the first 2 or 3 years, but definitely after the third 4 year mark. So I think it's really important for anyone out there that's starting or owning a business or thinking about it, that you really need to think about what is that kind of work environment you want to create. How do you describe your culture and how that becomes really the key differentiator in terms of the kind of people you want to hire and attract. And by the way, and I should stop there, but I was going to talk about, you're not always going to get it right. It's not like I'm 100% track record in terms of hiring. I mean, you're going to hire, there are some positions that are really hard to hire, especially professional services, business development being one of them. So you're not always going to get it right, but how you manage that, how you handle that, is just as important as the people that are successful that you have long term.
Yeah, there's so many parts of what you said that we could do whole shows on. If I was to boil all of it down, I would say I've been doing this since the mid '90s, and I've seen infinitely more bad matches than I have bad candidates and bad companies. Getting the cultural piece right is infinitely more important than the skill set, because a lot of the skill can be trained. If that person was a bad match for your organization, it doesn't matter how well they can do the job, because they're never going to be a congruous piece of the whole. They're never going to, I hate to say it this way because it sounds negative, but they're never going to be a cog in the machine. They're always going to be that piece of grit that comes things up. And you hit on several elements that help to keep that moving when someone's hired. And I swear to gosh, he's not shilling my book, because we're clearly cut from the same cloth. So many things you've said I talked about, but I call it EFG leadership framework: engagement, fulfillment, and growth. But engaging with your team in building an environment where positive and negative feedback is not only accepted but appreciated really helps to lengthen tenure, because people feel heard and valued. But it also helps you as a long-term leader from getting stuck in an echo chamber where you start to make mistakes. And that's huge. Ray Dalio talks about it with his work in his company. But it's huge. I think he calls it radical honesty.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to stay aligned in terms of expectations and deliverables. But I also would say a big mistake that a lot of people make, not in any kind of business, is trying to hire exactly for the experience and expertise that you need.
Yes.
Now, there's some positions clearly the expertise is a black and white thing. They either have or they don't. But even for me, and I can use half the people's examples. They had great experience, they had a great track record, but they didn't have the expertise needed for the role I hired them into. They evolved into that because they were
Yes.
smart enough, they had the talent enough, but more importantly, they had those intangibles: their dedication, their ability to learn, their ability to commit, the ability to be dedicated, the ability to grow. And sometimes, we have to realize we have to be a curator of talent. It's
Yes.
not, no one hits the ground running. It's, do you create an environment where people realize they're not always going to get it right from day one? That's going to take time to ramp up. That's going to take time to develop, and it's going to take time to develop their expertise. My number two person, who's now been with me for 15 years. She had a great background, great track record, but it was in a completely different career when I hired her. And but there, again, going back to those intangibles, there's qualities and intelligence and dedication and work ethic and commitment, amongst other things that I knew that were there, that I was willing. Yes, there's a risk. There's a risk for her. There's a risk for me. But here we are, 15 years later, and she's my number two person and is a superstar. Now, Some of that, yes, is mentorship and creating the right work environment, but most of it is her. Most of it's her dedication
Of course.
and commitment and ability to learn, but also ability to take feedback. Those first few years, definitely is mentorship and coaching involved. So I think that one of the biggest things I would say as an entrepreneur, going back to this conversation, there's really two things you got to really be thinking about, and it's really hard depending on how early stage you are. One is like when I first started, I was doing a lot of the work. I was a self-funded, organically grown startup, started with me and a bunch of contractors. So I started hiring people. You got to shift to start developing and managing and leading. So a lot of entrepreneurs are, don't always, and not just even entrepreneurs, a lot of leaders, managers, they're so focused on, especially in startups, doing the work and getting execution. They forget the leadership management part of their job and mentorship and coaching and feedback. It's so critical. The second thing is you got to pull out a piece of paper and write down, what do you mean by culture? How do you
Yes.
describe culture? What are your values? What's your purpose? What's your aspiration, your aspire state, as I like to refer to it? What are the behaviors that describe that culture? What's the work environment you're trying to create? What are those intangibles you're looking to hire? When someone says, "Hey, why should I work for you?" What do you value? How do you recognize reward? How do you support? How do you deal with failure? How do you deal with mistakes? How do you deal with successes, all those things? You've got to be able to have a really strong articulation. What you and I talked about before, and I often talk about, you got to align your external brand with your internal brand, no matter how
Yes.
small you
Yes.
are, even if you got with one employee, because that sets the tone for your future of, what your brand is, how you articulate what you mean by culture.
Yeah, again, a lot to unpack there. Number one, off the top, I should let you know now, I will be stealing curator of talent. That is now a term I'll be using. So thank you, and I apologize in the same frame. The second thing that you mentioned that I want to talk about is your number two. You hit on something there that's key. Again, we call it EFG, engage, fulfill, grow. But in the grow place, a big mistake that growing companies make is they find a person that's an exact match for the role, that can do 100% of what they need from day one. That person has nowhere to go beyond that. And then the leader is surprised when that person becomes frustrated because they have no internal growth opportunity. That person's not incentivized to stay if there's not a place for them to use that growth. So I love that you look to somebody outside who was the right person but had ways that they could grow inside the role, and it sounds like in a next role as well. So I think that's a big part of maintaining stability and growth in an organization, is that people who have the capacity to grow in their roles are more likely to stay. Using a technology example, because that's where I do most of my work. If you're a technologist and you allow your technical skills to stagnate, you're diminishing your value in the marketplace. No sane technologist is going to do that. So if you can afford them the opportunity to grow in their skills in your organization, it's one of the things that you can use to incentivize their retention.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, yeah, there's many pieces to that, but I also want to, give another example, because some people may hear what we're talking about and say, okay, well, I got to hire people that okay, I hear a check. I hear you got to hire people that are going to fit your intangibles, your culture. But I would also say, don't hire everybody like you. Don't hire
yes,
everyone that's the same
yes,
profile in terms of personality. It's not what I'm suggesting. So as an example, literally almost everybody in my team, I think I may have two people that have similar behavioral profiles. We're all completely different. I literally have a complete diverse personality skill set of people. Part of it's because they're reflective of the roles they in, right? Takes different behaviors and strengths to be successful, right? Someone being a consultant is going to be very, very different than a client manager,
yes.
than a business development person, than someone running a business unit, right? So those are all very different competencies, different skills, different behaviors, different strengths. So and also the value of not only making sure that you hire people that are a good fit for certain roles, but having people of different experiences, different backgrounds. It's that diversity of thought, the diversity of perspective and lens. when people bring different perspective based on not only experiences, but also because of their perspective, it really strengthens you as an organization. Again, the big assumption, they feel valued and heard. So it's really important to create that kind of environment, no matter however you want to describe your culture, what kind of culture you're trying to create. So don't be, again, a mistake I think a lot of entrepreneurs make is, well, I got to hire a person that's like they're all the same. Like, no, yes, they have to be able to work well in a very very fast moving entrepreneurial environment. But having those diversities of skills and strengths and behaviors is also just as critical.
I need to stop you there because I don't want to move past this topic. You give me great big balls of things I could spend an episode unpacking, but I don't want to go past this. So many years ago, when I first left the Marines, I worked for an organization in retail management where the owner of the company would only allow people to ascend internally if they had been a store manager first. So regardless of what you did in the company, if you were in a leadership role, you started as a store manager, then you did obviously proved you could do well in that role, and then he would give you opportunities in leadership or in training or in whatever else. On the good side of the equation, decisions were able to be made quickly because there was a unity of thought. On the bad side of the equation, and this dramatically outweighed the good part, everyone had the same answers. We all went to, when you were hired by him, he flew you to Oswego, New York. You spent 2 weeks going through his academy, living in a literal renovated frat house, going through his academy, learning the way he did things. You then went to a store and ran that store the way that you were taught, of course, and then graduated out to other roles. Literally, whenever there's a problem, everyone had the same answer. It was just a bred-in weakness. And an extreme example, but it really gave me a lived experience to know why diversity of thought is so important.
Absolutely. And again, that can be a scary proposition because again, some people are going to feel that their opinion's not valued. And let me give you very specific examples. Many people are very assertive, very, driven and, go through walls, and they also like healthy debate, which for a lot of people, they would interpret that as headbutting or, enjoys conflict. And, the opposite of that, someone who's very about harmony and about collaboration. And frankly, that kind of personality doesn't enjoy healthy debate. They're more passive aggressive. They want everything to be harmonistic, so they don't enjoy conflict. Some people, we all know, are very extroverted, very relationship oriented. Some people, and they like to think on their feet and express their opinions as they're thinking. Some people need to process. Some people are more analytical, a little more reserved, and are not as comfortable sometimes in a group environment. Some of us are very risk oriented, very change oriented, and people are the opposite of that. So it's understanding, identifying those characteristics, which are behaviorally based. They're all behaviorally measurable. We use these tools, by the way, in organizations with leaders and teams. And I should actually kind of give you people context. So one, I'm an executive coach, which I didn't mention that. So I actually work with leaders and leadership teams from a coaching, advising standpoint, and strategically. Second, as an organization, we do leadership development. We do organizational effectiveness. We do a lot of work on culture, and we also do a lot of work around assessments and talent optimization. So kind of give people context of why I talk about this stuff, because it's what we do and what our expertise is. So understanding, the differences of people and how they can still add value, in conversations and decisions, but how you have to bring that, some people are going to sit there, and a perfect example is a highly dominant person is going to facilitate a discussion or maybe a decision in a room. And of course, the extroverts and people who are also highly assertive are going to be very comfortable having discussions, debate. And then there'll be always a few people who are quiet in that room. They're either more reserved or frankly, they enjoy conflict, going the examples I mentioned earlier. And you walk out of that meeting thinking everyone's agreed. And of course, the people who are more reserved are probably still processing. They haven't necessarily decided if they agree or disagree. And the people who are lower in dominance are probably disagreeing, but didn't feel comfortable because they don't want to deal with the conflict in a room. And they're the ones, going back to passive aggressive behavior, who are now probably informing colleagues and how they disagree with that decision, a day or two afterwards the meeting. So, that's a good example, a very tangible example why it's so critical to understand the makeup of people and how to get people to feel comfortable to participate. So that way you truly have alignment when it comes to discussions and decisions and direction. And personality and style and type of person, in addition to level and role and expertise, is a really, really critical component of this.
Yeah, and even defining what healthy debate is in your organization. Healthy debate when I was in the Marines was dealt with behind the barracks when no officers were around. That's not the way I would imagine you would want it to be dealt with in your company. So even just defining what that means, I think, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to what's the work environment. If people, it's one thing to say, I'm going to set the tone and say, yes, I really value people's opinions and I want people to participate. I want people to contribute. But the moment they actually try, especially if they're not that assertive, especially if they don't enjoy conflict or more about harmony, the moment they feel they're shut down or they're not being heard or their opinions not being valued, they're not going to participate moving forward.
Yes.
The other thing that's really important, and we talked about this a while ago, but if you want to try to create an environment where people feel comfortable challenge the status quo, it's really, you can almost argue it's about innovation. Innovation is not always about new products and services. Innovation is about, can we do things differently? And whether it's operationally, whether it's around execution, whether it's around servicing clients, you want people to be always thinking out of the box instead of just staying within the lane of doing their job. So that's part of, again, assuming that's the culture you want. So how do you create that? When there's failure, when there are mistakes, are people going to feel they're going to get crucified or lose their job? Well, if they do, guess what? They're probably not going to stay. They're not going to leave their lane. They're going to stay in the lane, regardless of what kind of personality type they have. So these are
If
all
I can interrupt
tangible
there,
characteristics.
I'm sorry to interrupt. But I
Okay.
want to hit that part heavily. Not only do you lose that person, but you send a very clear message to every person who has a similar personality type that their voice is not valued and that they should not open up in a meeting or whatever setting. I think that's huge.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's there's so many aspects of this. To your point, each of these things we're talking about could be an episode in itself. But what I'm trying to do is paint a picture and almost a formula of some of the really critical things. And you're never too small. You're never too
Yeah.
big on focusing on culture and also leadership. Because we're really talking about both. We're talking about, as a leader, as an owner, as an entrepreneur, how do you create and define what you mean by this, and then how do you show up every day and spend time with your people, and how you hire and how you develop and reinforcing your work environment on a day-to-day basis. There shouldn't be a month that goes by that you're not spending time thinking about, what am I doing to reinforce my culture? What am I
Yes.
doing to recognize, reward, provide feedback, and also make sure we're all on the same page of not only where we are, but where we're going and how we're going to get there. What does that mean for every single person? And even for those of you who have different layers of managers, how you're spending time with your leaders and your managers, making sure they're on the same page, and not just culture and strategy and direction and reward and recognition, but also how you provide feedback, how you manage expectations. So, your ability to manage and mentor and lead and focus on culture is one of the most important parts of any entrepreneur, any CEO, any executive's responsibilities.
I couldn't agree more. And the thing I think that the audience needs to understand is, regardless of whether or not you consciously build a culture, every company has one. The question for you as the
Yep.
leader is, are you accepting the default culture that grows organically based on the people that you put in the room, or are you going to engineer a culture that's designed to help you and that team get to the next level?
Yeah,
Um,
I want to just talk about one other aspect I think is really important. And, having been doing this, and I'll have to admit to the public here now 40 years, um, There's one
Impressive.
thing I've learned, Jerry, is, and I've talked to many executives and many CEOs over the years on this, including my own experiences. And there's never been an executive or that said to me, I moved too quickly in managing somebody out of my organization. If
Yes.
anything, the biggest issue is we take too long, or we don't address not just poor performance, poor behavior. Because then
Yes.
going back to culture, the key is how do you hold everybody accountable to not only performance, and that includes, by the way, if they're struggling, making mistakes, making errors, you still need to give people a chance to grow and and develop. But there's got to be a healthy timeline that says this person's just not a good fit. Either they don't fit our culture, or they just can't perform. Now, by not taking action enough or quickly enough, you're unfortunately eroding your culture and you're eroding the performance and motivation of your people around you. So, and managing that in a very professional, respectful way is also really, really critical. So, again, for everyone out there, and I would almost argue that we're all at any given time struggling with somebody, whether it's because of behavior or it's because they're struggling to do their job. Yes, they need coaching, they need feedback, they need understanding what's expected, and then they need to be held accountable to that and given a certain time frame. But then you need to go ahead and make a decision, because the longer it takes you to do that, the longer erodes your culture in creating a high performance, work environment and organization. So don't wait too long.
And your
Make sure you're
credibility
on
as a
top of
leader.
that. Yes, it's
You know,
really a huge issue.
I,
Because the longer you take, or in the classic example, and this is not a new example, but classic example is a person who's got really critical expertise, or they're a high performer, but they're terrible for your culture because they don't
yes.
demonstrate the right behaviors. By not addressing that, you're eroding your culture, or people basically look at you and say, "Yeah, you may say that you believe in culture, but you're not. You don't demonstrate that by how you hold people accountable to your culture." So both performance and culture, meaning people how they demonstrate the right behaviors, is just as critical.
And there's something to remember too. So I too am a proponent of hire slow, fire fast. I have been in the embarrassing position earlier in my career as a sales manager to let somebody go, then go to tell the team, and in my inexperience, expecting them to be upset and have them say, "Jerry, what'd you wait so long for? That guy was the worst." So I've been there. I know how that feels. But it grew from there to the point that when I'm talking to folks in the interview cycle or at the latest early in their orientation, I explain to them, you have 100% of my support. I will do everything I can to assist you to succeed in your role. But understand that if at a point it becomes clear that you can't or won't do the job, we're going to part ways. And the reason we're going to part ways is because you're never going to thrive here. And I would like to see you in a place where you can. And
Right.
number two, it's resources. I can't do that to the team. And real quick, before we go on, two
Yeah.
things. Number one, I am going to entice you back to talk about leadership purely, because leadership and culture are incredibly intermingled, but they're great independent topics as well. And the second thing is, we've covered a pretty wide swath already. If you could give any early stage leader or business founder one piece of advice as it relates to our topic or otherwise, what would that be?
Yeah, I think I hit a bunch of them, but I would
Yes.
say you need, if you haven't done this, take out paper and pen and write out what you mean by culture. How you describe that? How is that reflective of your external brand, your internal brand? Why do people want to buy your products and services, and why do they want to work there and have a career there? That's the one. If there's anything I would say, focus on right now. If you haven't done that exercise, and by the way, when you've done that exercise, how do you then tie in your people, processes, and systems so it's systemized into your organization? So that I know we haven't answered that question, but yes, that's the one thing I would have people do.
I love that. I love that. And I want to kind of do a deep cut back to the beginning of the show when you mentioned first starting your company. It was just you doing most of the work and a bunch of contractors. That begs the question, and I think it's an important thing to elaborate on, how your organization changes based on its life cycle. So,
Mm-hmm.
so quite clearly, CPG Partners today is a wildly different organization than it was back then. So when you're building out that culture and you're engineering your leadership styles in that organization, how does that change based on the life cycle of where that business is at?
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question. There's so many parameters to that, but in generically speaking, the hardest thing for an entrepreneur to do, and again, how much funding you have and how quickly you're scaling is a huge factor. But letting go of the day to day in general is really the most critical thing you can do,
Mm-hmm.
because most entrepreneurs are heavily involved in the day to day or the execution side of the business. But there's some point as you scale that you have to make that pivot, and that's really, really critical. And part of that's going to be how you start ramping up in terms of staffing and the people that you're hiring and the people you surround yourself with. But you have to start pivoting because the biggest mistake most entrepreneurs make is they have a hard time letting go of the day to day
I
and
couldn't
making
agree
that shift.
more. And when I'm working with founders and they're growing, that's one of the things that I tell them. I word it a little bit differently. I say the sooner you can become an internal consultant in an organization that can focus on either the biggest threat or the biggest opportunity, the more freedom you have to really expand it at that hockey stick rate we all aspire to.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that, but I also would add to that, most entrepreneurs and many of them, especially in the scientific and technology communities, are technical experts. The opportunity for them is they have to be more externally focused.
Yes.
It doesn't mean they're not hiring people to be externally focused for themselves, but any CEO has to be paying attention to the future of the industry, competition, innovation, what is, customers reactions and feedback. They have to be externally. They need to stay connected to the customer, to the marketplace, and the industry. So the mistake a lot of CEOs make because of their behaviors and their strengths and their comfort level is they're very internally focused and often too internally focused. So the external focus is really critical.
Completely agree. And I think that there are a couple different answers to that problem, if problem is the right word. And it's probably not, but we'll stick with it for now. And I can think of some examples. So earlier in my career, I worked with a technology services company where the founder of the company was a software developer who utilized his relationships to pick up projects for his friends, enjoyed doing that, had some success with it, spun it into a company, grew it to about $5 to $7 million in revenue, and realized that he didn't really enjoy the business part of the business as much as he thought he did. So he brought in professional management, and in 3 years they brought it to 40 million, and they were acquired about 2 years back by Kelly Services at well over 100 million in revenue. And the lesson for him was it's not that I can't do this, it's that I don't enjoy it as much as I thought I did. So he
Right.
brought in people to do that part. The second part, and I'm sure you've seen this as a consultant, an organization will only grow to the level of its leader. So if that leader isn't willing or able to continue to expand, they're limiting the possibility for that organization.
Yep. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, listen, we've covered so much material. It's obvious we could go for another 2 hours. I would love you to come back and maybe talk about leadership specifically. But as we're wrapping up, if people want to learn more, and I can't imagine why they wouldn't want to learn more, where can they find you, Chuck?
Yeah, I mean, they can find me many different ways. My LinkedIn profile, message me there. It's really under my name, Chuck Mollor, Mollor. Reach me through our website, one of our websites, mcgpartners.com. So, yeah, those are probably the two easiest ways to reach me.
If you could please mention your book so people can find it.
Sure. It's called The Rise of the Agile Leader. Can you make the shift? So it
I
talks
love it.
about not only what we call the future of leadership, which is now, it's been the last few years, but it's also a roadmap how to get to the next level as a leader, no matter where you are, what level you are.
I regret not pulling it out prior to the show because I can't find it
That's
on my
okay.
shelf. I would hold it up right now. No, that's awesome. Chuck, thanks very much for sharing your knowledge. This is an important topic to me. Company culture simultaneously gets a lot of attention, but not, I think, that enough of it. It's talked about, but not in a way that I think that most founders understand its importance from the beginning.
Well, it's one of those really kind of esoteric terms, right? What does really culture mean? And I think it's really important to define it. And the marketplace has many different variations of definition, but ultimately is about what is the work environment? What do you value? How do you recognize reward? And frankly, what is success for people and how you create that in work environment for people? And it's a day to day thing. It's a week to week. Yeah.
Exactly. And at risk of rekindling a conversation, we're winding down. If you don't have that, it's impossible to find people that align with it because you haven't defined it in a way that you can share it with people that would join that organization, and you dramatically increase the risk of misalignments that lead to bad retention.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to stop myself because, again, I could clearly talk to you for hours. Chuck, thank you very much for being on the show. You are a welcome guest. I'd love for you to make this a home and have you back on the program many times.
Yeah. No, I love to do that. Let's do it. Let's get together again and we'll talk about leadership, Jerry.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Chuck.
All right. Take care.